Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham.
Chapter 11. Gauche. The moral asymmetry sprung from the guilt felt by liberals toward the wretched of the earth overlaps, though it is not identical with, a primary rule of liberal strategy. This rule, which anyone may verify by a cursory study of liberal behavior over a moderate period of time, may be stated as follows: the main enemy is to the right. Viewing liberalism from the outside, a more exact wording might be, the preferred enemy is to the right. This rule is a matter of feeling, principle, conduct and history. It is a basic parameter of liberalism understood as a personal attitude and as a political tendency. Referring to the development of progressive and radical political views in their own country from the 18th century on, the French put a similar point still more unconditionally. Il n'y a pas d'ennemi à gauche. There is no enemy to the left. That formulation is perhaps too extreme for the main body of modern liberalism, though it undoubtedly holds for liberalism's own left flank, as represented, for example, by most of the authors of the liberal papers. But all wings of liberalism unite in finding that the main enemy, the preferred enemy, the enemy that one enjoys coming to grips with, is to the right. This rule is a matter, to begin with, of feeling. A liberal may agree that there is or can be a threat from the left, but to a liberal, a threat from the left does not feel the same way as a threat from the right. As the liberal sees it, some persons on the left are doubtless mistaken in some of their views, even rather badly off course, but the liberal feels instinctively that their intentions are good, that they are aiming at the right goals, and that you therefore have a chance to sit down and reason things out with them, to negotiate differences. Even communists, bad as they are not hopeless. You can discuss test bans and disarmament with them, work out agreements covering this or that particular crisis, seek out areas of common interest, carry on trade, expand communication through cultural and scientific exchange, take measures to reduce tensions, and so on. In domestic affairs, you will often find the communists lining up on the decent side of such issues as civil rights, congressional inquisitions, academic freedom, colonialism and peace. But those extremists over on the right are a different breed, as the liberal feels them. There's no getting anywhere with them by reasonable methods and compromise. Not only are their methods disruptive, provocative and inflammatory, their goals are all wrong, and even the intentions of many of them are obviously vicious. For that matter, people on the right are so full of reactionary prejudices and anti-intellectual bias that it's really pointless to try to work things out, so far as they are concerned, by discussion and negotiation. With them it's just a question of who is stronger. The Western liberal community united into a solid and impassioned front against the totalitarian threat of fascism and Nazism, called long before 1939 for the fullest sanctions, up to and including war, to bring them down, and joined full-bloodedly in the demand that the anti-fascist war should be fought through to unconditional surrender. Against the no less totalitarian threat of communism, there has never been a solid and uncompromising liberal attitude, much less a united liberal determination to use measures of a firmness thought routinely appropriate in dealing with fascism. Many liberals, many thousands of liberals, have found it to be in no way incompatible with their principles that, among the sponsors of public committees, causes, organizations and petitions, their names should appear alongside the names of communists or known communist fellow travelers. Those same liberals would have cut their throats, politically speaking, if they had been publicly associated in such manner with fascists or fascist sympathizers, would indeed have refused, do still refuse, to permit any public link between themselves and any right-wingers much short of fascism. To meet the menace of Nazism or any sort of fascism, to bring to heel apartheidism or a colonialist imperialism governed by a rightist regime, it seems to liberalism self-evidently proper to call for boycotts, embargoes, refusal to purchase goods made in the fascist or right-wing countries, ostracism of the musicians, artists, writers or professors who go along with their regimes, cessation of mutual tourism and of cultural contacts except through outlawed refugees, support of revolutionary opposition, denunciation of compromise as shameful appeasement, and for war itself in the end if all else fails to bring the enemy down. But the response to communist and other far-out leftist regimes is gentler, more, shall we say, rational, more in keeping with the rationalist principles of the liberal creed. In relation to these, liberalism senses at once the promise held out by an increase in cultural exchange, a mingling of peoples with peoples, a multiplication of international gatherings, of gradually expanding trade, enlarging tourism, negotiations official and unofficial on many topics at many levels, searching for those areas of common interest and concern, and a general readiness to try all available means that might keep the dialogue going according to Mr. Hutchins' prescriptions. No dialogue with Franco, however, even if Franco's system, though a long way from democracy, is not and never has been totalitarian, and can be called fascist only by a snowball use of words, even if Spain has not been and could not be a serious threat to American or world security. But Franco is a man of the right, and must pay for his rightist sins even unto the second and third decade after his wars have finished. For many American, British and French liberals of the older generation, the Spanish Civil War of 1936–39 was the determining episode of their ideological lives. They have retained a permanent emotional and moral commitment to the side they continue to call the Republicans, much as many veterans of the First World War kept a lifelong commitment to the strange comradeship of the trenches, or as businessmen relive in their emotional and drunken moods their college days, or as a romantic soul returns always to his first young love. For these liberals, time does not cloud the clarity of the choice they made in the complex Spanish combat, nor does the accumulated record suggest to them that the realities of 1936–39 may not have been quite so unequivocal as they then seemed. The outrages done by Franco's minions of the right, the interventions by Nazis and fascists, the sorrows of the anti-Franco exiles, are kept fresh in memory. But the facts about the outrages done by the Republicans and their associates, about the control of the international brigades by the Soviet secret police and the liquidation of anti-communists, about the assimilation of so many of the anti-Franco veterans into the international communist apparatus, often into its espionage and terrorist sections, about the exploitation of the Spanish question to the manifest detriment of Western unity and strength, somehow such facts, though it is no longer possible for anyone to deny them, do not penetrate the ideologized fibers of a liberal psyche. With his mind, the liberal knows that there was much frightfulness on both sides of the Spanish Civil War, and totalitarian intervention in both directions, so that the moral claims with respect to the war's conduct fairly well cancel out. And if it were a case where a clear balance of moral evil were chargeable to the left's account, as, say, in the matter of the Moscow Purge trials that were simultaneous with the Spanish Civil War, he would hasten to remind us that water so long over the dam had best be forgotten. But Franco is to the right, and the main enemy, the preferred enemy, the eternal enemy is and must be to the right. The program of Americans for Democratic Action has illustrated with laboratory purity the application of the enemy to the right rule to Franco's Spain. Over the years, including Stalinist years when there was no chatter about peaceful coexistence or internal Soviet liberalizing, as well as post-Stalinist years when strategic bases in Spain became important elements in the Western defense system, the official ADA program, readopted regularly by each annual convention, declared, "We unequivocally condemn the fascist regime in Spain. We favor political and economic support to the government in exile and to the democratic forces within Spain." That is, ADA stated its support of an anti-Franco revolution. Let us add that more than 15 years after the end of World War II, the ADA program was still reminding its members and the public that Germany's record of cruelty and inhumanity should not be forgotten. But nowhere in its program or in any other policy declaration has Americans for Democratic Action ever called for support of the struggle for liberation in the countries captive to communism in Eastern Europe. With the Soviet Union we are advised to show an understanding of legitimate aspiration, and to keep trying both negotiation and conciliation while waiting for relaxation and greater personal freedom within the Soviet regime. Playing similarly by the rule, Americans for Democratic Action, like most liberals, has long recommended giving diplomatic recognition and United Nations membership to Mao Zedong, and withdrawing recognition from Chiang Kai-shek. Tito is of the left, and toward the left charity comes readily into the liberal heart. It quickly covers with its gentle veil the tens of thousands of corpses of his countrymen over which Tito marched to his seizure of power, including so many thousands of the finest men of those Christian families who for so many centuries defended the European marches, the fraudulent trial and killing of the Yugoslav patriot who had led the fight against the Nazis, the fraudulent trial and imprisonment of Yugoslavia's religious leader, the thousands of administrative arrests, the infamous deeds of the secret police, the property stolen and families broken up, his own closest colleague jailed for speaking a small part of the truth. There is no point stirring up old coals on the left. Tito is to be immediately welcomed as a colleague in the United Nations of peace-loving states, while Franco is sternly kept outside the gate. Tito is to be nourished with money, food and goods, while liberal groans attend the granting of any concession to Franco even as part of hard-headed bargaining that gains crucial strategic concessions in return. Pablo Casals, liberal ideologue in his own right as well as major figure in the liberal litany, will play no more in Spain after Franco. But in the spring of 1963 he played in Budapest. Yes, Budapest. Boiling in oil is too generous a fate for a brute like Cuba's Fulgencio Batista. And he was a savage brute, most certainly, though savage mostly to certain of his own countrymen, not much to others. In dealings with the United States, for example, he granted the first missile tracking site on foreign soil, supported its international policy without deviation, gave the Pentagon every military facility it sought, and welcomed trade and business. Still, let us grant that Batista deserved boiling. But that bearded young romantic, Fidel Castro, when he first appeared on the horizon? A little wild, perhaps, with a few bad companions. But expressing the aspiration of his people for freedom, justice and well-being. Someone to work with, to help, to advise, to make plenty of allowance for. These were the things the liberals were telling us in the months before and for a while after Castro took power. In April 1960, 15 months after Castro seized power, Professor Robert J. Alexander, writing in ADA World, the official organ of Americans for Democratic Action, continued to give duly abject expression to the liberal sense of guilt in telling us that the denunciations of the United States by Castro were well deserved because they were
largely due to the recent history of our relations with the Latin American countries.
6 months later ADA World indignantly protested the notion that Castro might be linked with Moscow and the communists.
Castro's hold,
declared this keeper of the liberal seals,
comes from what he has done for his people, not what he has done for the Russians.
As late as February 1962, when Cuba was being rapidly transformed into a Soviet base, ADA World not only protested fiercely against the idea of United States support for any sort of armed action against Castro as
in violation of the charters of the UN and the OAS,
but insisted that it was
no time to take unilateral economic sanctions against Cuba.
Simultaneously, it is hardly necessary to add, Americans for Democratic Action were already calling for economic and political sanctions against South Africa and Portugal, and offering no objection to the military actions, and terrorism, that had begun in Angola. For Castro was a man of the left. Without exception, as I have already noted, the preponderance of liberal opinion has been in favor of at least the early phases of every revolution in this century that has seemed to come from the left and to be directed against the right, of the Russian and Chinese revolutions both pre-communist and communist, the Indonesian Revolution, the Algerian like the Cuban, Nasser's Revolution or Qassim's, Betancourt's in Venezuela or Salal's in Yemen, the revolutions now, 1963, in their preliminary stages in Angola, Southern Rhodesia and South Africa. In the last chapter we remarked how the liberal's selective indignation is controlled by his feeling of guilt toward the poor and oppressed, who gain an immunity from the moral condemnation that is reserved for the powerful and privileged and for himself. Often, though not invariably, this moral attitude coincides in practical application with the strategic tropism that seeks the enemy to the right. In many though not all cases the poor and oppressed are deployed among the contingents of the left when they become active politically, and thus the liberal's automatic sympathy with them as wretched reinforces his strategic impulse to stand with them, or at least not against them, as left, and both the feeling and the strategic rule tend to make him see their enemy as his own. Indeed, by a little ideological ingenuity, the feeling, moral judgment and strategic rule can be brought into full harmony. If it happens that a goodly number of the poor and oppressed do in fact line up with a man or leadership seemingly of the right, as they have done with a Perón, a Franco, a de Gaulle, or even, to be quite honest about it, a Hitler, then we will merely explain that they have been deceived by demagogic right forces that are exploiting the ignorance of the masses. What kind of deed is it that is most sure to arouse, and to arouse most vehemently, a liberal's indignation? To arouse, in the first place, his mere interest, since no one can become indignant about something if he fails to notice it. Left-wing trade unionists and Marxian politicians massacred by Franco strike a liberal's attention more forcibly than nuns, priests and tradition-minded peasants massacred by Franco's opponents. A liberal, like every sane man, burns with appropriate indignation at the thought of the Nazi death camps. Indeed, the liberal revives his horrified memory of them continually, long years after Nazism perished, with books, articles, movies and television spectaculars. But the thought of the deaths at Katyn Forest, the carefully scientific slaughter by the Soviet secret police of the bulk of the Polish officer corps, in which were numbered the elite capable of leading an independent Polish nation after the war, is dulled and sparks no flame. Deaths in the Forest, the remarkable book on Katyn by J.K. Zawodny, passed, when it was published in 1963, like a shadow in the night, like the other books on Katyn before it, beginning with the moving and wonderfully written Terra Inhumane, by Joseph Chapsky, the Polish artist and hero who was the first man outside the Russian apparatus to come to realize that thousands of his countrymen had suddenly ceased to exist. We have already considered how this same selectivity permitted an elevated indignation at the terror of the European paras and secret army, constituting the political right in the Algerian equilibrium, though most of the secret army's supporters were poor enough, and sufficiently wretched in the dismal prospect of exile, and at the same time an indifference toward, even a justification of, the much more extensive and ferocious terror of the Arab revolutionaries, in that context accepted as constituting the left, and a similar indignation at Portuguese, the right's, measures to put down the revolt in Angola along with indifference toward, even support of, Holden Roberto's, the left's, measures, among them some new and ingenious methods of automated torture, to further that revolt. Nor is it hard to imagine the campaign of liberal indignation that would have resounded to the highest heavens if, in 1961, it had been Franco's agents instead of Israel's who had kidnapped, in Argentina, not Adolf Eichmann but an ex-officer of the GPU control squad of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and brought him to Madrid for trial in a glass cage. The strategic rule and the segregated emotion hold for domestic as for international affairs, for small things as for large. Liberals are sensitive about violations of academic freedom, free speech and other civil rights, but their sensitivity is much more surely and more keenly aroused when the alleged victim is of the left. In truth, most liberals do not notice and can scarcely believe that citizens of the right are ever among the victims. And yet it is not so infrequently that someone adhering, in one way or another, to an ideological tendency to the right of liberalism at least believes that his rights have been invaded, that he has lost his job on a college faculty because of his opinions rather than his professional performance, that he has been prevented from speaking in a forum where he was rightfully entitled to present his views, that a bureaucratic decree has blocked him from running his farm or business in the way he judges to be his right to do, that because of his political stand he has been unrightfully discriminated against in seeking to sell his labor or his talents. He may be sure that whatever its objective deserts, his case will never become a cause célèbre in the fight for civil liberties. With luck it may be immortalized as a footnote in a liberal sociological essay proving that right-wing political views are the expression of the schizoid paranoia of the insecure lower middle class. More likely, it will vanish without a trace. To a liberal it seems eminently normal that all members of the political science or history or economics or philosophy department of a university should be, as in many important cases they are, liberals plus a few somewhat left of liberal. But it seems shocking if a sizable percentage is of the right, even a rather moderate right. Nearly all liberals believe communists should be allowed to speak on college campuses, and most liberals believe communists should be permitted to teach in colleges, and there have been many liberal campaigns of protest against the attempts of some college administrators to prevent communists from speaking or to fire them from faculties. There is no comparable liberal solicitude for fascists or even for those belonging to what liberals like to refer to as the radical right. Even the strictest civil liberties liberals, who do defend in principle the right of fascists to speak in a public place, are seldom around when the issue comes up. In both Britain and the United States, liberals began in 1962 to develop the doctrine that words which are inherently offensive, as far-right but not communist words seem to be, do not come under the free speech mantle. From the annual millions of examples of the liberal rule in action, let me select one other that has a classic quality for clarity of outline as well as the stature of the protagonist. In the spring of 1962, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, liberal of liberals, delivered the fourth James Madison Lecture on the Bill of Rights to the New York University Law Center. He took as theme the evils in the world around us that resulted from the failure to understand and protect the freedoms proclaimed in the Bill of Rights. He cited just three specific instances: the suppression and persecution ordered by Premier Menderes of Turkey against press critics of his government in the late 1950s, the ex post facto laws passed by the military junta that seized power in South Korea in 1960, the precautionary arrests made by the Pakistani government in 1962. Now no one will dispute that these three acts did in truth violate Bill of Rights freedoms, though it might be added that other issues, perhaps not less important, were also involved. But how remarkable, or, rather, since he is so total a liberal, how inevitable, that it was three violations such as these and no others that came to Justice Douglas' mind as he surveyed the record of recent history, in each case, a violation by a man in government of the right. In the lively sectors of his memory there were evidently not to be found those rather substantial violations of freedoms that occurred during those same years, they say, in Hungary, or Kwame Nkrumah's suppression, jailing and exiling of all his political opponents, or Gamal Abdel Nasser's equally one-party, one-opinion regime, or Sukarno's press and opinion controls, or Mao Zedong's handling of critics, or Julius Nyerere's declaration that there is room for only one party and one policy in Tanganyika. But it is irrelevant to draw out the list, for these are men of the left. I have heard many a liberal, many a time, wax indignant at the treatment accorded this or that leftward-leaning teacher who appeared as witness before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, but I have never heard any liberal become indignant over the brazen, shrewdly planned contumacious behavior through which Communist Party members called as witnesses, their party lawyers and the audience assembled under control of party agents seek to destroy the integrity of the legislative process. And I have very seldom heard a liberal so much as mention the elaborate manipulation of the minds of tens of thousands of students carried out over the years, under detailed party directives and continuous party supervision, by the thousands of party members and fellow travelers who have taught in the American educational system. In reviewing these diverse episodes and issues, I do not mean to raise the question whether the liberals' attitude toward Franco, Tito, Hungary, J. Edgar Hoover, the Soviet Union, Pandit Nehru or any other person, nation or event has been right or wrong. Possibly it has been invariably right, possibly, always wrong, more probably, granted a significant norm for judgment, sometimes one and sometimes the other. But that is beside the present point. Nor do I mean to blame or condemn liberals for revealing a double standard in their conduct as well as attitude toward non-liberals of the right and of the left. Liberals are not the only human beings guided by that sort of double standard. My purpose has been only to illustrate by a sufficient number of varied examples that liberalism does in truth operate according to this double standard, that its location in what Professor Schlesinger likes to call the vital center is not equidistant from the left and right extremities, that it is a verifiable fact that liberalism finds, or tends to find, its main enemy, its preferred enemy, to the right. This does not imply that liberals never see an enemy to their left and never actively oppose persons or tendencies that are left of liberalism. They do of course, and on some critical occasions, usually as a last resort when all mediating alternatives have been exhausted, some liberals will treat the further left as for the given hour the main enemy. But this never gives a liberal an unmixed satisfaction, and he is especially uneasy when he finds that in his bout with the left he has a self-invited ally from the right at his side. His conscience can be really pure and his heart fully uplifted only when he is riding full tilt against a right-wing ogre. Is there any doubt that it is indeed a strategic rule of liberalism to prefer to find and do battle with an enemy on the right rather than to find him on the left? Am I pounding here on an open door? Quite possibly so. I do not think there is really any doubt about the rule, and if there is, the confirming evidence is overwhelming. Still, I have found that some liberals, though like all liberals they feel and act according to the rule, do not want to acknowledge it. They feel a little shamefaced about this enemy to the right rule when it is brought fully out into the open. It seems to suggest a trace of both logical inconsistency and moral hypocrisy, like some other rules that incorporate a double standard. In one sense perhaps the suggestion is accurate. The formal principles of liberalism concerning rights, duties, equality, negotiating disputes instead of fighting about them, and so on are quite general. They do not show on their faces why terrorism or dictatorship is worse from the right than from the left, or violating a leftist's civil liberties worse than violating a rightist's, though, as always, a sufficiently ingenious dialectician can straighten out the logic, and a practiced casuist can no doubt untangle the moral knots. But in any case, whatever puzzle attaches to the rule from the standpoint of liberalism's internal doctrine or its moral self-righteousness, it is in a pragmatic sense a legitimate and inevitable expression of liberalism as a social tendency. It is not a merely arbitrary prejudice or quirk of temperament. Liberalism is linked to the tendencies on its left, and distinguished from the tendencies to its right, by most, though of course not all, of its basic principles and primary values, by its conception of human nature, its secularism, its egalitarianism, its attitude toward change and social reform and indeed much of the content of the recommended reforms, its stress on an egalitarian social justice, its attack on social discrimination, and so on. Liberals frequently reflect this overlap, by implication at least, when they say of communists or left-wing socialists, right-wing socialists and liberals having become more or less wholly assimilated in our time they have the correct ideals and goals, but their methods are wrong. To some liberals, I have known more than one such, communists seem not much more than liberals with guts, and even the liberal spokesmen of the American government refer to the areas of common interest shared with the communists, not to speak of the 57 varieties of socialist. It is harder to think of a man with whom you have much in common as your sworn enemy, than of another who is just not your sort of person. Or, enlarging the perspective, liberalism is itself of the left, la gauche, o sinistrismo, part of the great left wave that we can trace back to the French Revolution and on into the Renaissance, and liberalism, even though it belongs to the rightward flank of the left, feels more at home with its cousins of the left than with the strangers of the right. Historically, moreover, it is against the social forces of the right that the liberals and their ideological ancestors have usually found themselves fighting. What has come to be called the right has been and is still bound up with organized religion, a hereditary aristocracy, the armed forces, landed property, business, the interests, and robber barons, both terms coined by liberal ideologues, caste or racial discrimination, bound up, that is, with the superstitions, customs, prejudices, privileges and traditional institutions against which the impetus of liberalism, both theoretical and practical, has always been directed. In preferring and choosing the enemy to the right, modern liberalism is true to its heritage. The liberal tendency to see the main enemy on the right is not, then, something accidental or temporary, but of the essence of liberalism. Modern liberalism reached what historians of the future will define as its zenith during the struggle against Hitler's Nazism and Mussolini's fascism, a struggle in which, of course, liberalism was allied with both socialism and communism. The menace of the right then reached what seemed to be a new and peculiar intensity, and this menace constituted for liberalism a supreme challenge to which it triumphantly responded. It was through liberal leadership in so many phases of the anti-Nazi struggle that liberalism became intricately entrenched within the structure of Western society and dominant for the formation of Western opinion. So necessary for liberalism is the enemy on the right that when he does not exist, liberalism must invent him. This is why, I think, the Nazi menace is kept on the public stage by journalists, historians, movie directors, TV producers, novelists, preachers and demagogic politicians, with a prominence that has no objective historical justification. And I think this necessity had, too, a good deal to do with the symbolic and grotesque career of Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was in large part a liberal creation, as his liberal and suitably anti-McCarthy biographer, Richard Rovere, has concluded. A second-rate small-town politician, with no organization or machine, no competent staff or administrative talent, very little money at his disposal, not backed by any serious economic or social force, attracting mostly third-raters as his ardent admirers, McCarthy could not possibly have got very far without the help of the Liberals. The Liberals required an enemy on the right. All real ones of importance were beaten down or in quiescence, so in their desperation they invented McCarthy and Mccarthyism. McCarthy was particularly needed by the faculties of the great American universities. Their members felt not only a gnawing vacancy on the right, they were facing the most painful of all situations for liberal intellectuals, that of discovering themselves to be, though subjectively committed to nonconformism, conformist members of a virtually 100% conforming community. By means of the created symbol of McCarthy, the dangerous thrill of nonconformism was recovered, imaginatively, of course. In real life, a McCarthyite actually found in the university would have been shunted back to the farm leagues, or sent to a psychiatrist. The McCarthy balloon collapsed, with disappointing speed, as soon as a few people decided to give it a prick or two. But the problem remains. Year after year the nostalgic liberal mythmakers renew the attempt to transform a moronic Jew-baiter, an addle-pated ex-soldier or a retired candy merchant into a monster worthy to be target of the liberal sword. In November 1963, the liberals of all nations found themselves utterly unable to assimilate the fact that President Kennedy had been shot by a confirmed and longtime Marxist. The liberal ideology had to be summoned post-haste on a psychic rescue mission. Fact was quickly verbalized into myth, and soon everyone understood that, whatever the accidental appearances of the moment, the real culprit was, how could it have been otherwise, the old, familiar and reassuring dragon, the right. In sum, then, if we are to understand liberalism existentially, not as an abstracted set of principles but as a historical tendency of human beings believing certain ideas, having certain sentiments, and acting along certain general lines, then we must recognize that the enemy to the right is integral to its definition. Without the enemy to the right, liberalism does not exist.